I traded you for 10 horses, Mountain Man told the fat girl, but she's worth more than all. Fort Laramie had seen its share of harsh dealings, but nothing prepared the crowd for the words that thundered across the trading ground that cold autumn morning in 1895. I traded you for 10 horses. The declaration hung in the air like the crack of a rifle. Heads whipped around. A few soldiers paused mid-step. Trappers, traders, and Lakota hunters turned to see who had spoken. Clementine stood on the wooden platform, wrists bound, dust streaking her bruised cheeks. She was heavy-set, with the round softness of a woman who had known hunger, yet carried the weight of hardship on her frame. Her dress was torn at the hem, her shoes scuffed from years of labor she had never been paid for. Even her hair, thick, dark, and tangled, seemed tired of suffering. Mortimer Blackwell, the man who claimed ownership of her, shoved her forward as if she were nothing more than livestock. "A good deal," he crowed, rubbing his thick hands together. "Strong girl, works hard, don't complain much, worth every hoof." The crowd laughed cruelly, the kind of laughter that stings more than fists. No man takes a girl like that. 10 horses? You should be paying someone to haul her off. Clementine lowered her gaze, wishing she could disappear into the earth. She had learned long ago that humiliation spread faster than fire on the frontier. Then came the shift in the crowd, a hush, heavy and sudden, like wind dying before a storm. Tobias Bear McAllister stepped through the ring of onlookers, a mountain of a man. He stood nearly 6'6", built like the forests he lived in, shoulders broad enough to cast shade over the entire platform. His long black hair was tied back, his beard thick, his coat made of grizzly hide that hung heavy to his knees. Scars crossed his forearms like old stories carved into stone, and his voice, low, gravelly, unhurried, rolled across the trading post. "The trade is done," he said. "The girl comes with me." No one laughed now. Men who had mocked her shrank back. Others whispered his name like a warning. Stories about him drifted from fort to fort. The lone horse tamer who rode wild stallions bareback, the man who fought a cougar with nothing but a hunting knife, the hermit who lived where snow never melted and silence ruled the mountains. Clementine looked up at him, fear and disbelief wrestling in her eyes. Why would a man like him trade 10 fine horses for a woman the world had taught her was worthless? Tobias glanced at her once, steady, unreadable, before turning to Mortimer. "Undo the ropes." Mortimer hesitated. He knew better than to cross a man called Bear. The ropes fell. Clementine took her first free breath in years, and as Tobias placed a hand on her back, guiding her away from the jeers and the platform, she realized something unsettling. Whatever awaited her in those mountains, it could not possibly be worse than what she was leaving behind. Before we continue, where are you listening from tonight? Which city or country? The trail leading out of Fort Laramie twisted along the edge of the river, dust rising beneath the hooves of Tobias's stallion. The trading post noise faded behind them, the clatter of wagons, the thump of crates, the laughter of soldiers who had seen far too much and far too little all at once. Soon, only the wind remained, brushing cold fingers across Clementine's bruised cheeks. She sat in front of Tobias on the saddle, stiff as a plank, unsure of what to do with her hands. She held them in her lap, trying to keep her breathing quiet so he wouldn't hear the trembling in her chest. His arm was braced around her waist, solid and unyielding, but not rough like Mortimer's hands had been. Tobias didn't grip her as a man holding property. He steadied her, just enough so she wouldn't fall. The contrast confused her more than any cruelty ever had. Mortimer Blackwell had dragged her into a life of servitude after her father died, owing him money. He fed her scraps, beat her when he pleased, and called her useless so many times she could no longer remember the sound of her own worth. She had learned to keep her gaze on the ground, her voice soft, her hope silent. But Tobias, he was silent in an entirely different way. It wasn't the silence of cruelty. It was the silence of a man who had spent so much time alone that words had become optional. They rode for nearly an hour before Clementine gathered the courage to speak. Her voice was barely above a whisper. "Why did you do it?" Tobias didn't answer immediately. He rode through the shallow water of a creek, letting the horse drink. Only when they were moving again did he speak, his voice low and steady. "I needed 10 horses." It was the closest thing to a joke she had ever heard from a man like him, and she didn't know whether to laugh or cry. Before she could decide, he added, "And I couldn't leave you with that man." The simplicity of the statement struck her harder than any explanation might have. Men in her life had always spoken in demands, insults, or drunken rambling. Tobias spoke like someone who had nothing to prove. She looked down at her hands, at the bruises fading into yellow patches along her wrists. "People say I'm not worth much." Tobias gave a quiet grunt, not of disagreement, not of agreement, but of irritation with a world that valued the wrong things. "People who talk like that don't know anything worth hearing." Clementine blinked rapidly, unsure how to accept words that didn't cut. They continued deeper into the rugged country where the smell of sagebrush hung thick and the mountains rose like ancient guardians against the horizon. The land was harsh but beautiful, shaped by wind and time. Clementine felt small against its vastness, like a misplaced piece of someone else's life. After some time, they stopped near a fallen log. Tobias dismounted first, his boots sinking into the soft earth. He turned and lifted her down with ease, though she apologized the moment her feet touched the ground. "I'm heavy," she murmured. "You're fine," he said simply, brushing dirt from her sleeve with surprising gentleness. "Rest a moment." She sat on the log, shoulders rounded, hands fidgeting in her skirt. Tobias moved with deliberate calm, checking the saddle, refilling his canteen, scanning the ridges as if listening to the mountains themselves. Watching him, Clementine realized something startling. This was a man who did not waste movements, emotions, or words. Everything he did had purpose. Everything he didn't say carried weight. She wondered what kind of life created a man like that. What kind of losses? What kind of loneliness? She wanted to ask. She didn't dare. Instead, she said, "Mortimer was going to sell me again, wasn't he?" Tobias's jaw tightened beneath his beard. "Eventually. He said no man would ever want someone like me." She swallowed. "He said even 10 horses was too much." Tobias crouched in front of her, his gaze steady and unflinching. "Mortimer is a greedy coward who's never done one honest day's work. His opinion has the worth of a nail snapped in half." Clementine's eyes stung. She looked away, embarrassed by the sudden warmth in her throat. Tobias stood and extended his hand. "Come on, we've got a long ride ahead." She placed her palm in his. His grip was warm, calloused, steady. The touch sent a ripple of something through her, a memory, of what safety might feel like. When they mounted again, she leaned slightly into him for balance. He didn't shift away. He adjusted his posture, making room for her without comment, as if her presence was expected. The sun dipped lower, staining the plains gold. Fort Laramie vanished behind the curve of the land. Clementine did not know where Tobias was taking her, and the fear of the unknown pressed hard on her ribs. But for the first time in years, fear wasn't the only thing there. Something else was blooming quietly beneath it. Possibility. By late afternoon, the land began to rise, folding into the first gentle slopes of the mountains. The prairie grasses thinned, replaced by scrub pine and stone that jutted from the earth like ribs. The trail tightened into a single path, worn by hooves and weather, climbing steadily toward the high country where Tobias lived far from the reach of men like Mortimer Blackwell. Clementine felt every shift of the horse beneath her. Hours in the saddle had stiffened her legs, and her lower back throbbed with a dull ache she fought to hide. She didn't want to appear weak, not after Tobias had traded 10 horses for her, not after she had already taken enough space, enough trouble, enough air in other people's lives. But the mountains didn't care about pride. As the dusk settled over the land, her body swayed harder with each step of the horse. Tobias felt it. "You're tired," he said. It wasn't a question. It wasn't an accusation. He said it the same way he might note that a cloud was building from the west. She stiffened instinctively. "I'm fine." "No," he answered, calm as always. "You're not." The horse slowed at his command. Tobias swung down first, boots hitting the ground with a solid thud. He reached for her, his hands firm but careful as he lifted her from the saddle. For a moment, her knees trembled too much to stand. She flushed with embarrassment, but Tobias steadied her without comment. "We'll rest," he said. They stopped beneath a tall stand of pines. The scent of resin drifted on the cooling air, mingling with the faint smoke of some distant camp or lightning-strike fire. Tobias guided her to a fallen log and took a small tin cup from his saddlebag. "I've got water," she whispered. "You don't need to—" "I'm not offering a choice." He handed her the cup. She drank. The cool water eased her dry throat. When she finished, Tobias took the cup back and sat beside her. Not close enough to crowd her, but close enough that she could feel the warmth radiating from him. A silence stretched between them, not the uneasy silence she'd known with Mortimer, where words were traps waiting to be sprung, but a quiet that felt almost protective. Tobias seemed content to watch the horizon where the sky changed from gold to violet. Clementine stole a glance at him. The mountains had carved him the way rivers carve stone. Deep lines cut across his brow from years of sun and wind. His shoulders were built from labor that never asked for recognition. A man like him could have lived anywhere, taken work, taken women, taken whatever life offered. Instead, he chose solitude, the solitude of a wounded animal, she thought, a bear with old scars and a quiet heart. "Do you always live alone?" she asked softly. His eyes remained on the distant peaks. "Most of the time." "Doesn't it get lonely?" "Sometimes." He paused, considering his next words the way he considered every step of the trail. "But loneliness isn't the worst thing in this world." "Then what is?" "Being trapped someplace you don't belong." Her breath caught. She didn't need to ask how he knew that feeling. It was written into the tired edges of his voice, the parts of him that never let down their guard. A faint chill crept in as the light faded. Tobias noticed that too. He rose, walked to his horse, and returned with a rolled blanket. Without ceremony, he draped it around her shoulders. The rough wool scratched her skin, but its warmth reached deeper than the fabric. "I can manage," she said, though her voice lacked conviction. "I know," Tobias replied, "but you don't have to prove anything to me." No one had ever spoken to her that way. The quiet honesty in his tone made her eyes sting. They resumed their ride as the twilight deepened. Stars bloomed slowly across the sky, each one a pinprick of cold fire. The mountains loomed larger, darker, more mysterious. Clementine felt Tobias's breath warm on the back of her neck as he leaned forward slightly, guiding the stallion with a gentle pressure of his knees. "You said you take people to your land sometimes," she murmured. "Do others live there?" "No." His answer came quick, final. "Just me." "Then why bring me?" Tobias didn't respond for several heartbeats. The horse's hooves clopped steadily along the stony path, echoing against the canyon wall. Finally, he said, "Because someone needed to." She turned her head slightly, trying to read his expression, but the shadow of his hat concealed it. She wasn't sure whether his words were the truth or whether they hid something much deeper, something he wasn't ready to say aloud. Night swallowed the last of the light as they reached the mouth of a narrow valley. A cold wind swept through, carrying the distant sound of running water. Tobias's posture shifted, alert but familiar, like a man stepping over the boundary of his own home. "Not far now," he said. Clementine exhaled slowly, unsure whether to feel fear or relief. The wilderness had a way of stripping a person down to their truest self. Tobias seemed to belong to it. She wondered what the mountains would make of her. Would they swallow her whole? Or would they, like him, find something in her that she had never been allowed to see? The first sight of Tobias's valley came just as the moon rose. Its pale light spilled across a wide basin ringed by towering pines and rugged cliffs, turning the land silver. A stream wound through the center like a dark ribbon, its waters whispering secrets to the night. Scattered across the meadow, shadows moved, 40 horses grazing peacefully under the stars. But the cabin was what held Clementine's gaze. It stood at the far end of the valley, built from thick logs, solid and weather-worn. A soft glow leaked from its single downstairs window, flickering like a heart beating warm in the cold wilderness. Tobias guided the horse toward it. When they reached the porch, he dismounted and lifted her down gently, as if her weight meant nothing. Her legs nearly gave out beneath her from exhaustion, but he steadied her with one hand while opening the door with the other. Inside, the warmth wrapped around her instantly. A fire crackled in the stone hearth. The room smelled faintly of pine resin, smoke, and something she couldn't quite place. A quiet, earthy scent that belonged to the man who lived here. "This is home," Tobias said, his voice lower than usual, as though the cabin softened him without his permission. Clementine stepped forward, looking around with wide eyes. The cabin was simple, but unexpectedly tidy. A sturdy wooden table stood near the hearth, a row of hooks for tools by the door, and a set of shelves filled with hand-carved bowls and jars of dried herbs. A bearskin rug lay before the fire, curled like a resting creature. In the corner sat a rocking chair polished by years of use. There were 2 doors at the back of the room, one cracked open, showing Tobias's room, the other closed. He nodded to the closed one. "That's yours? Sheets are clean. There's water in the basin." Her breath quivered, partly from exhaustion, partly from the surreal kindness of being given a room, her own room, after years of sleeping on dirt floors or under tables where no one had to see her. "You rest tonight," Tobias said. "Tomorrow we set the work." She nodded, but before she slipped into her room, she glanced at the man standing near the fire, the way he rubbed the back of his neck, the way he avoided looking directly at her. She sensed something unspoken between them, something not yet formed, but undeniably there. She whispered good night. He answered with a low rumble that might have been a good night of his own. Dawn in the mountains arrived sharply, the sunlight cutting through the valley like a blade. Clementine woke to the smell of coffee and the distant snort of horses. When she stepped out of her room, Tobias was already by the stove, cooking breakfast in a cast-iron skillet. His hair was tied back, his sleeves rolled to the elbows, and the early light washed over him like a blessing he didn't expect, but quietly accepted. "You sleep?" he asked. "Yes," she whispered. "Better than I have in years." He nodded once, as if that was enough to please him. Then he placed a plate in front of her, eggs, fresh bread, and slices of salted meat. She hesitated. "This is too much for me." "It's not enough for you," he replied. "You'll need strength here." Strength? No one had ever said she needed that. Mortimer had said she needed obedience. Her father had said she needed silence. Tobias said she needed strength, as though he believed she already carried some of it inside her. After breakfast, they stepped outside into the crisp mountain air. The horses lifted their heads at Tobias's whistle, their breath forming small clouds in the cold. Clementine watched the way he moved among them, steady, fearless, speaking without words. The horses respected him, even adored him. "Stay close," he said, as he handed her a bucket of feed. She approached the stallion nearest her. It snorted and pawed the ground. Her heart hammered. She had known animals before, cows, a few goats, but never creatures this powerful. Tobias stood behind her, his presence a silent wall of reassurance. "They smell fear," he murmured, "but they trust calm hands." "I'm trying," she whispered. "I know." His voice was warm, not soft, but steady in a way that steadied her. Slowly, she reached out and placed the bucket down. The horse dipped its head, snorting softly. Its warm breath brushed her wrist. "That's it," Tobias said quietly. "You did fine." She looked up at him, surprised. Praise had never been part of her life. She didn't know how to hold it without shaking. He gave her one more nod and then turned toward the corral, expecting her to follow. She did, with a strange heat in her chest that felt almost like pride. As days turned to weeks, life settled into a rhythm unlike anything Clementine had known. She rose with the sun, cooked for them both, swept the cabin, mended gear, and learned the ways of the valley. Tobias showed her how to stack wood so it burned slow, how to store smoked meat for winter, how to repair a broken saddle strap, how to recognize the changing moods of the sky. He rarely raised his voice. When he did, it was at stubborn horses, never at her. When she struggled, he didn't scold. He simply said, "Again," and waited without impatience. When she fell off a horse for the first time, she lay in the grass, winded and humiliated. Tobias stood over her, arms crossed, watching her with a stern expression she mistook for disappointment. But when she managed to sit up, he offered a calloused hand. "You stand," he told her, "and you try again. That's how we learn up here." She took his hand, and she stood. Each small victory drew them closer, though neither spoke of it. Some evenings they shared supper in comfortable silence, the fire casting warm shadows on the walls. Other nights, Tobias told a story, short, simple pieces of his past. She learned he had once been a blacksmith. She learned he had known grief deep enough to drive him into the mountains. She learned his loneliness, not by what he said, but by what he didn't. One night, as the wind howled through the trees, they sat near the fire drying their boots. Clementine's needle slipped while mending a tear. Pricking her finger, she hissed softly. Without thinking, Tobias reached over, took her hand, and examined the tiny bead of blood. "You work too hard," he said. She shook her head. "I'm not used to being useful. I want to be." He met her gaze then, fully and without hesitation. Something unguarded flickered in his eyes, something that pulled at her heart with quiet force. "You are," he said simply. "You are very useful here." She blinked, caught off guard by the sincerity behind his gruff voice. Useful. On this mountain, useful meant worthy. It meant belonging. For the first time since childhood, she felt both. The fire crackled softly. Outside, the wind pushed against the cabin walls like an old friend asking to be let in. Tobias released her hand slowly, as though reluctant to give it back. Something was growing between them, not fast, not loud, but steady, like spring pushing through the last snow. By the time winter settled into the valley, Clementine had grown stronger in ways she never expected. Her arms bore new muscle from hauling wood, her steps steadier from long days working with the horses. Her cheeks carried a faint flush from the cold, replacing the hollow look she'd brought from Fort Laramie. Tobias noticed all of it, though he kept most of his thoughts hidden beneath his steady silence. But strength alone could not keep shadows from finding their way up the mountain. It began with small changes, things only a man like Tobias would notice, footprints where no one had reason to walk, the distant echo of a gunshot that didn't belong to any hunter he knew, a faint trail of smoke curling above the ridge one morning when no storm clouds were in sight. Each sign was quiet on its own, but together they stirred something old and alert inside him. One evening, after they had finished their supper, Tobias stepped outside to split wood. Clementine watched him from the doorway, the axe rising and falling with rhythmic force. His shoulders moved like he was working through something more than just firewood. She stepped out, pulling her shawl tight. "You've been uneasy," she said softly. "For days now." He paused mid-swing, the axe buried in a log. Slowly, he faced her. "Tracks up on the north trail, cigarette butts by the lower creek, not mine." She felt a cold coil tighten low in her chest. "Who would come up here?" "Men who shouldn't," he answered. He didn't say Mortimer's name. He didn't have to. Clementine felt the old fear brush her spine like an icy hand. But Tobias wasn't finished. He leaned the axe against the chopping block and crossed his arms. A posture she'd come to understand meant he was weighing truth against caution. "You've been holding something back," he said quietly. "Something I ought to know." Her throat closed. She had expected this moment, feared it even. She had wanted to tell him, but each day she hesitated, afraid her past would make him regret the trade, regret her. She looked at the ground, at her fingers twisting in her shawl. "My father owed Mortimer money," she began. "You know that part." But there was more. Tobias remained still as stone, but something in the air tightened around him. "When my father died, Mortimer said I had to work off the debt. I tried. I worked until my hands bled, until I could hardly walk. But Mortimer," she swallowed hard, "he didn't just want labor. He wanted ownership. Complete ownership." Tobias's jaw clenched. "When I resisted," she said, voice trembling, "he filed papers saying I was indentured to him. Fake papers. The law didn't care. It was easier to believe him than believe me." "He hurt you," Tobias said, the words low and shaken by barely contained rage. She nodded. "For 3 years." The silence that followed wasn't empty. It pulsed with the weight of something dark and personal. Tobias stepped closer, slow as a man approaching a wounded animal. His eyes held no pity, only a fierce kind of understanding. "You should have told me sooner," he said, not angry, not accusing, just honest. "I was afraid," she whispered. "Of me?" "No, of losing the one safe place I've ever had." That broke something in him. His breath left him in a harsh exhale, and he shook his head as if the very idea offended him. "You're not losing anything," he said. "Not to men like him, not while I'm here." Before she could answer, a faint crack echoed from the ridge, the snap of a branch under a boot, sharp and out of place. Tobias instantly went still. He lifted his hand, a silent command for her to stay behind him. The wolves, the storms, the mountains themselves had taught him the difference between harmless sounds and the kind that carried intent. He stepped forward, scanning the tree line. Snow had begun to fall, soft and fine. In the drifting white, a figure moved, just a flicker between the pines. Then it was gone. "Someone's watching," he murmured. Clementine felt her breath hitch. "Mortimer? Or the men he pays?" Tobias's tone dropped to something colder. He'd never climbed this far on his own, but he'd hire men who would. He ushered her back into the cabin, bolting the door. The fire threw long shadows across the room. Tobias checked his rifle, inspected each round, then set it within reach. "Listen to me." He turned to her, his face lit by the fire. "If anything happens, you take the back trail to the ravine. Stay low. Keep running. Don't stop." "I won't leave you," she said fiercely. "You will," he said, stepping closer, resting one broad hand on her shoulder. "Because I need you to live." Tears stung her eyes, not from fear, but from the way he said it. Like her life mattered, like she mattered. Another sound snapped from outside, the crunch of a boot sinking into snow. Clementine's pulse raced. "They're coming!" Tobias reached for his coat, for his rifle, for his resolve. "Then they'll learn what kind of man I am." He moved toward the door. She grabbed his arm. "Tobias, be careful." He looked at her, then looked in a way he never had before, as though seeing not just the woman she was, but everything she had survived to become. "I won't let them take you," he said, his voice low and certain. "Not now, not ever." As he stepped outside into the falling snow, Clementine felt the world tighten around her. Trouble had finally found its way up the mountain, and Tobias Bear McAllister was the only wall between her and the darkness she'd escaped. Snow drifted across the valley in slow, uncertain swirls, as if the storm itself were holding its breath. Tobias stepped onto the porch, rifle in one hand, the weight of his presence filling the space like a second wall of wood and stone. The cold hit him hard, slicing through his coat, but he remained still, listening. The mountains were quiet, too quiet. Then came the sound he expected, the low crunch of boots approaching in a staggered line. Shadows moved between the pines, dark shapes slipping through the falling snow. They came without hurry, as if confident that the wilderness itself belonged to them. Men like that underestimated the mountains, and they underestimated Tobias Bear McAllister even more. He called out without raising his voice, "Step where I can see you." 3 men emerged first, hard-eyed, wrapped in coats stained by long travel. Their rifles hung carelessly at their sides, but their swagger told Tobias all he needed to know. Hired guns, men who mistook cruelty for power. A 4th man stepped forward. Even from a distance, Tobias recognized Mortimer Blackwell's bulk packed into that fur-collared coat. His face was flushed red from the climb, sweat beading through his powdery breath. "Tobias," Mortimer called, mock politeness coating the syllables. "We came for what's mine." "She was never yours," Tobias answered. "She worked my debt," Mortimer snapped. 3 years, and she ran. That makes her property." "Not up here," Tobias said. "Up here, a woman's not a thing to own." Mortimer's lip curled. "You think you can hide her from the law?" "There's no law up here but honesty," Tobias said. "Something you've never had." The hired guns exchanged glances. The oldest among them lifted his chin. "We're not here to jaw all night. Hand her over. Alive's easier, but dead's fine." Inside the cabin, Clementine heard the words through the walls. Her fingers curled around the edge of the doorframe. Fear rose like smoke in her chest, but she swallowed it down. Tobias was out there alone, and she, the reason for this storm of trouble, was in here, heart-pounding, praying he wouldn't pay for her past. Outside, Tobias shifted slightly, the rifle still held loosely but ready. "Turn around. Last chance." Mortimer barked a laugh. "You traded 10 horses for a fat girl, mountain man. That was your first mistake. Think I'm making the second?" Tobias stepped forward once. Snow crunched beneath his boots. "She's worth more than any trade I ever made." The words slammed through the cold air harder than gunfire. Mortimer's face twisted with rage. "Enough!" he shouted. "Get him!" The first hired gun raised his rifle. Tobias fired before the man even finished lifting the barrel. The shot cracked across the valley, echoing into the cliffs. The man dropped to the snow with a thud. The others scattered, returning fire. Bullets tore through the lower porch posts, sending splinters flying. Tobias dove behind the corner of the cabin, moving with the precision of a man who had fought wilderness predators for half his life. Inside, Clementine jolted as the shots rang out. She clutched her chest, breath shallow. Her instinct screamed for her to hide, but her feet carried her to the window. She saw Tobias roll behind a boulder, firing again, his movements controlled, fearless, entirely focused on buying her another minute of life. A minute she couldn't waste. She ran to the shelf where Tobias kept the spare ammunition. Her hand shook, but she gathered the rounds quickly, stuffing them into her apron. Then she dragged her trembling body toward the door. She heard Tobias shout from outside, voice booming like a winter storm. "Stay inside!" She didn't listen. She threw the door open, ducking low as a bullet sliced the air above her. Snowflakes stung her cheeks as she sprinted across the porch toward Tobias's cover. "What are you doing?" he hissed, grabbing her arm and dragging her safely behind the boulder. "You need ammunition," she gasped. His eyes widened for a split second. Surprise, anger, something else flickering beneath. He loaded quickly, passed her his revolver. "If someone comes around the other side, you fire. Don't hesitate." The ground vibrated with approaching footsteps. Mortimer's men were circling, trying to flank them. Clementine lifted the revolver, her grip shaking. She'd practiced with Tobias before, but never like this. Never with life measured in heartbeats. A shadow lunged into view. Clementine screamed and fired. The man collapsed into the snow, his rifle tumbling from his grasp. Tobias shot another who tried to reach the cabin door. Mortimer fell backward into the snowbank, scrambling to stand, his bravado melting into terror. Tobias rose to his full height, rifle aimed squarely at the man whose cruelty had shaped Clementine's entire life. Snow swirled around them like drifting ash. "It's over," Tobias said. Mortimer shook, his voice cracking. Wait, don't shoot. I'll leave. I'll never come back." "You won't," Tobias said. "Not because you changed, because you won't get the chance." A final shot cracked through the cold. Mortimer slumped into the snow, the storm swallowing his last breath. Clementine lowered the revolver, her whole body trembling. Tobias turned to her, cupping a hand around her face, his thumb brushing the tears she hadn't even realized were falling. "You stood with me," he said, voice hoarse. "You didn't run." "I wasn't letting them take you," she whispered. His forehead rested against hers, snow melting in his beard as he breathed out the truth he no longer held back. "Clementine, I'll protect you as long as I draw breath, and I won't let anyone, man or mountain, take you from me." The wind quieted. The valley fell still. Together they walked back toward the warm glow of the cabin. The storm eased overnight, settling into a soft hush that blanketed the valley. By morning, the world outside the cabin looked purified, white drifts smoothing over the violence of the night before. No boot prints remained, no shadows of danger, just the mountains, tall and solemn, watching over the small cabin tucked beneath their shoulders. Tobias slept in the chair near the hearth, head bowed forward, his rifle resting across his knees. He had refused the bed, refused even to lie down, unwilling to leave Clementine unguarded for a single moment. Sometime before dawn, she woke and found him there, his chest rising and falling with the slow exhaustion of a man who had spent every ounce of himself to keep someone safe. She stood quietly, watching him in the dim glow of the coals. This giant of a man whose presence could silence a trading post full of toughened men looked almost peaceful in sleep, peaceful in a way she doubted he ever allowed himself to be. The lines at the corners of his eyes were softer, his breath steady, his hands capable of taking a life or gentling a wild stallion, relaxed for the first time since trouble had climbed the mountain. When Tobias stirred and opened his eyes, she was still standing there. He blinked once, twice, as though trying to place himself back into waking. "You stayed all night," she said softly. "I wasn't leaving you," he answered, voice hoarse with sleep and lingering adrenaline. She moved closer, hesitating only a moment before laying a hand on his shoulder. He covered it with his own, his palm warm and rough, grounding her completely. "You're safe now," he said, his voice lowering. "No one's coming back for you." Clementine's throat tightened. For years she had lived with the constant weight of dread, always listening for footsteps behind her, always bracing for the next cruel demand. But here, this valley, this cabin, this man, felt like the first place where fear didn't own her. "Tobias," she whispered, "I don't know what happens next." He looked into her eyes, steady and unhurried, as if what she said deserved consideration, not quick answers. "The mountains are wide," he said. Life up here isn't easy, but it's honest. If you choose to stay, I'll make room for you. A home, a life, whatever we build. And if I stay, where do I belong in it? She asked, her voice barely carrying. His thumb brushed the back of her hand, slow and sure. Right beside me, he answered. She closed her eyes, letting the warmth from the hearth seep into her bones, letting his words settle in places of her heart that had never known anything but cold. Outside, the sun crested the ridge, casting golden light across the snow, touching the cabin walls with promise. The horses began to stir, their breath rising like smoke into the morning air. The world felt new, uncertain, yes, but open in a way she had never imagined. Clementine looked around the humble cabin, the sturdy beams, the neat order, the marks of a life lived simply but sincerely. Then she looked at Tobias, the man who had saved her life twice now, once by trade, once by standing between her and mortal danger. Maybe I belong here, she murmured. Maybe this is home. Tobias didn't smile, not fully, but something softened at the edges of his mouth. He stood slowly, towering over her, yet gentler than the firelight. It's your home if you want it, he said. The mountains don't turn away anyone who's strong enough to face them. And I'm strong enough? She asked, not in doubt, but in wonder. You've proved it, he answered. Her breath trembled, not from fear, but from the fragile, shimmering thing rising inside her. Hope. They stood there in the warm glow of morning, the cabin still around them, the world wide open. Nothing was promised, nothing guaranteed, but for the first time in her life, the uncertainty didn't frighten her. It felt like possibility. Stories like this have traveled across mountains and prairies for generations, kept alive by folks who understand what it means to struggle, to hope, and to find unexpected kindness in a hard world. If you're listening tonight, know that these old frontier tales only matter because someone like you is out there hearing them. Tell me, where are you listening from? Which corner of the world holds your story? And if you still believe that love can rise from places we least expect, stay with me. The next story is already waiting.